these two series of photographs, although they're totally different, I think they're somewhat related in that they're complete series. They both happen to be top-heavy subjects, but just to start, the motors that I've shot here they're found artifacts in a way, but they're also these were the first motors that were there when people were starting to explore parts of the coastline, non-human powered craft. So there were steamships and there were people canoeing and First Nations canoeing, and everyone was exploring the region, obviously, and resource extraction was part of that. But these personal motors, in a way, allowed sort of anybody, any solo individual, who was maybe not even that robust, to be able to go around and explore the next headland. So I'm interested in that history a little bit of the fact that these were the motors that were there while the explorations were happening. And they could become more than just a single motor as a series, but each of these motors has that particular history, maybe for a certain part of the coastline here. And I think taking them out of the context of a garage or a boatyard or on a boat, you really see the shapes and how sort of humanistic and but obviously very robotic and maybe droid-like shapes and they're floating around. And I think it's because they're hovering, they give you there's a shadow, and they seem to be floating, perhaps ready to fly away into the future, even though they're obviously just old outboard motors. But some of these motors are 100 years old, and along that, in those 100 years, many stories and tales of fish lost or adventures had or mishaps and possibly drownings, who knows. These motors were there for a lot of those adventures, and I appreciate to think that some of these scratches and dents and the paint jobs and the patina of the paints and the scratches in all the steel and whatever, that's the history of that's one way of writing reading the one of the histories of the coast. So I appreciate sort of not knowing which stories happened with each of these motors, but for sure every one of these motors had a tale. And maybe I'm not really interested in knowing each individual tale. I just like the idea that they're there and they represent something that changed the landscape of the BC coast. The second part of the show, so totally unrelated in many ways, except that it's a similar isolation of something that maybe we find fascinating because they have fish on their heads, but that's kind of potentially voyeuristic. Besides that, they're beautiful portraits of beautiful women. So incredibly strong, doing incredibly an incredible balancing act of carrying huge amounts of fish on their heads. That's what makes it a series. The colors and the locations are interesting as a foreigner. Also, I don't want to pretend that it isn't voyeuristic in some way, but it's more of an appreciation for their grace, considering how arduous and heavy and hot the days are there, and how much lifting how much manual labor they're doing. So, but again, I isolated that what we might find peculiar, and made a series of that. And they're both kind of top heavy. The fish on the women's heads, impossibly heavy. Some of them nearly 80 pounds perhaps on top of their heads, and then these motors also top heavy. That's totally unrelated, but visually that stands out. And both just different times. That's happening over in Africa now. People carry stuff on their heads like that now. Here we don't, but it's that's just a fact of geography, nothing else, and culture and history.